Margaret Johnson sat alone in her darkened classroom, trembling hands clutching a donation check that would change everything. The numbers blurred through her tears, more money than Riverside Elementary had seen in years. Made out in honor of a child she had nearly broken. 3 weeks ago, she had made a phone call that would haunt her forever. 28 years of teaching. And she had never felt shame like this. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she replayed those devastating words. Stop filling his head with grandiose fantasies. The irony cut deep. She who prided herself on hearing truth had refused to listen when it mattered most. An 8-year-old boy had told her stories about his father building cities, riding special buses, changing lives. She had called him a liar. Now she knew the truth, and the truth was going to destroy her. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. 3 weeks earlier, the autumn morning sun cast long shadows across Riverside Elementary as Margaret Johnson arranged her third-grade classroom with practiced precision. At 52, she had been teaching for 28 years, long enough to recognize every type of student and parent who walked through her door. Divorced and living alone with her cat Hemingway, Margaret had grown increasingly cynical about what she called entitled parents and their tall tales. The recent disappointment of being passed over for the principal position had only sharpened her edge. She prided herself on seeing through children's fabrications, protecting them from the harm that came with unrealistic expectations. Among her new students this year was Ethan Williams, an 8-year-old who had transferred to Riverside just 6 months earlier when his family moved to Memphis. The boy was unusually articulate for his age, with thoughtful brown eyes that seemed to absorb everything around him. Unlike his more boisterous classmates, Ethan spoke carefully, as if weighing each word. What set Ethan apart were his stories about his father's work. He would talk excitedly during show and tell about how his father was building a whole new city for people and drawing pictures of entire neighborhoods on giant papers. The other children sometimes whispered that Ethan made things up, but Margaret had noticed something different in his voice, a genuine pride that rang with sincerity. What Margaret didn't know was that Ethan's father, Marcus Williams, was indeed exactly what his son described. At 35, Marcus was a respected community development architect who specialized in affordable housing projects. Born profoundly deaf, he communicated through sign language and writing, navigating the professional world with quiet determination and exceptional skill. Marcus was also a widower, having lost his wife Sarah in a car accident 2 years prior. The move to Memphis represented a fresh start, a chance for both father and son to heal, while Marcus oversaw his most ambitious project, yet a revolutionary inclusive housing development that would serve as a model for cities across the South. Riverside Elementary itself reflected the changing demographics of Memphis, serving a diverse mix of working-class families and young professionals in a neighborhood experiencing rapid gentrification. The school, like many in the district, struggled with outdated facilities and tight budgets, creating an environment where teachers often felt overwhelmed and defensive. As Margaret straightened the last of her bulletin boards that Monday morning, she had no idea that her assumptions about one quiet boy and his imaginative stories would soon challenge everything she thought she knew about listening, believing, and the dangerous power of prejudice disguised as protection. The first signs of trouble began on a Monday morning when Ethan Williams raised his small hand during dismissal preparation. "Mrs. Johnson, may I please stay after school today? My daddy is sending the special bus to pick me up." Margaret paused in her gathering of papers. "Special bus? What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Regular buses don't go to the construction sites," Ethan explained matter-of-factly. "Daddy says it's not safe for regular buses where they're building the new neighborhoods, so he sends a special one just for me." Margaret nodded accommodatingly. Assuming this was simply a working parent's transportation solution, she watched as other children filed onto their buses, chattering about weekend plans and after-school activities, but she couldn't help noticing the whispers among Ethan's classmates. "He always has weird stories," she overheard Jake Miller tell his friend. "My dad says nobody's building new neighborhoods around here." Tuesday brought more elaborate details. During their community helpers discussion, Ethan's hand shot up eagerly. "My daddy builds houses for people who don't have any," he announced. "He draws pictures of whole neighborhoods on giant papers, And then construction workers make them real. He showed me the blueprints. They're as big as our kitchen table. Margaret studied the boy's animated face as he continued. Daddy says every family deserves a safe place to live, so he designed special houses that don't cost too much money. And he makes sure there are parks for children and places for grandparents to sit in the sunshine. The story was detailed, certainly, but as Margaret looked at Ethan's simple clothing and basic school supplies, doubt crept in. If his father was truly an important architect, wouldn't there be more obvious signs of prosperity? She had seen this before, children embellishing their parents' modest jobs to gain status among peers. Wednesday's late pickup solidified her suspicions. Ethan waited patiently for 45 minutes after the final bell, reading quietly in the classroom while Margaret graded papers. When a large van finally pulled into the pickup lane, Margaret walked outside with him. The vehicle was indeed larger than typical family cars, but it appeared to be simply a modified van. The driver remained inside, offering only a wave to Ethan through the windshield. Margaret found this odd. Most parents got out to greet their children, or at least rolled down windows to acknowledge teachers. "Ethan, honey," Margaret said gently as they approached the van. "That's just a regular van, not a special bus." The boy looked up at her with confusion. "But it is special, Mrs. Johnson. Daddy made sure it can help people who need different kinds of doors and ramps. See?" He pointed to modifications Margaret hadn't initially noticed: wider door frames and what appeared to be accessibility equipment. "That's very nice, dear," Margaret replied diplomatically. "But let's try to stick to facts when we share stories at school." As Ethan climbed into the van, Margaret caught a glimpse of the driver, a man in simple work clothes who waved politely but said nothing. The interaction felt strangely distant, adding to her growing certainty that something wasn't quite right about the Williams family's claims. The whispers among other teachers began during lunch duty. "Have you heard about the new boy's stories?" asked Janet Rodriguez, the second-grade teacher. "Yesterday he told his reading group that his father is designing an entire city." "Children have such vivid imaginations," replied Tom Harrison from fourth grade. "Though I worry when they get too elaborate, usually means something's lacking at home." Margaret found herself nodding along. She had indeed heard variations of this before: children from modest backgrounds creating grandiose narratives about their parents' occupations. It was a coping mechanism, she understood, but one that could lead to embarrassment and disappointment when reality inevitably intruded. Even the parents began talking. During afternoon pickup, Margaret overheard conversations among the other families. "My daughter says the new boy claims his father is some kind of famous architect," one mother mentioned skeptically. "But look at how they live, hardly seems likely." "Some families just have delusions of grandeur," another responded. "I feel sorry for the child, really, setting him up for disappointment when other kids figure out the truth." The building tension was palpable. Ethan, sensing the growing skepticism around him, became quieter during class discussions. When asked to share during show and tell, he would start enthusiastically about his father's work, then trail off when he noticed classmates' dubious expressions. Margaret watched this dynamic with mixed feelings. Part of her felt protective of the sensitive boy, but another part believed that gentle reality checks were necessary. She had seen too many children hurt by parents who filled their heads with impossible dreams. By Friday afternoon, as she watched Ethan wait once again for his special transportation, Margaret had made up her mind. Someone needed to have an honest conversation with Mr. Williams about the difference between encouraging a child's imagination and setting him up for social humiliation. She had no idea that her assumptions would soon shatter everything she thought she knew about truth, communication, and the dangerous power of prejudice disguised as protection. Thursday morning arrived with an empty desk where Ethan Williams usually sat. Margaret checked her attendance roster and found a brief note from the office: "Ethan Williams absent, fever." She felt a twinge of concern for the quiet boy, then returned to her lesson plans. During her lunch break, Margaret retrieved Ethan's emergency contact information from the main office. The card was simple and sparse: Marcus Williams, text only, urban development consultant. She stared at the phrase text only with growing suspicion. In her experience, parents who insisted on text communication were usually trying to avoid direct contact with teachers, either because they were too busy to care or because they wanted to avoid uncomfortable conversations about their children's behavior. The designation felt evasive, adding another layer to her mounting doubts about the Williams family. "Have you seen that van that picks up the Williams boy?" asked James Miller, the school custodian, as he emptied the wastebasket near Margaret's desk. "Driver never gets out, never comes inside, just sits there waiting, sometimes for an hour or more." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "I've noticed that too. Most parents at least wave or acknowledge the teachers. It's unusual behavior." "Makes you wonder what they're hiding," James continued. "Normal parents want to know how their kids are doing in school. They come to conferences, volunteer for field trips. This family keeps their distance." The seed of suspicion grew throughout the afternoon. Margaret found herself wondering why a parent would so deliberately avoid face-to-face contact with school staff. In her experience, engaged parents wanted regular communication with teachers. The Williams family's communication preferences felt like deliberate avoidance. That evening, Margaret decided to take action. Despite the text-only instruction, she felt that Ethan's concerning storytelling patterns required immediate parental intervention. She dialed the number listed on the emergency card. The phone rang several times before connecting to a professional-sounding voicemail. "You have reached Marcus Williams, Urban Development Consultant. Please leave a detailed message, and I will respond as quickly as possible. For urgent matters, please send a text to this number." Margaret felt her skepticism deepen. Anyone could record an impressive voicemail message, and the title Urban Development Consultant sounded deliberately vague, exactly the kind of inflated job description she might expect from someone encouraging their child's grandiose fantasies. She left a carefully worded message. "Mr. Williams, this is Margaret Johnson, Ethan's teacher at Riverside Elementary. I'd like to schedule a conference to discuss some concerns about Ethan's classroom contributions. Please call me back at your earliest convenience." Friday morning brought no return phone call, only a brief text message. "We'll discuss Ethan's needs in person. Scheduling conflict today. Please send specific concerns via text." Margaret interpreted this response as further evasiveness. A genuinely concerned parent would make time for a phone conversation about their child's welfare. The insistence on text communication and scheduling conflicts felt like stalling tactics. Her frustration deepened during her planning period when Sarah Chen, a young teacher from down the hall, stopped by to chat. "I've been working with Ethan in reading enrichment," Sarah mentioned. "He's remarkably gifted, reads at least 2 grade levels above his peers. He's been checking out architecture and urban planning books from the library, quite sophisticated for his age." Margaret dismissed this information with practiced certainty. "Smart children sometimes create the most elaborate fantasies. Sarah, intelligence can make their stories more convincing, but that doesn't make them true. I've seen this pattern many times over the years." Friday afternoon brought Margaret's patience to its breaking point. Principal Dorothy Hayes mentioned that the Williams family had submitted several accommodation requests for school communications, asking for written materials and alternative contact methods. Margaret interpreted this as an attempt to receive special treatment through manufactured sob stories. "Some parents will go to extraordinary lengths to make their children seem special," Margaret confided to Dorothy. "I suspect we're dealing with a family that uses elaborate narratives to gain sympathy and accommodations." Determined to cut through what she perceived as deception, Margaret decided to call Marcus Williams directly, ignoring his stated communication preferences. This time, the call connected differently through what sounded like an automated relay service with an operator announcing the connection. Margaret, unfamiliar with disability relay services, became immediately frustrated with the unfamiliar protocol. The operator's explanations about communication procedures sounded like unnecessary complications. When she hung up and called again, the phone was answered by a mechanical-sounding voice that Margaret assumed was some kind of voice alteration technology. "Mr. Williams," Margaret began, her voice tight with contained anger. "I've been teaching for 28 years, and I know when children are being fed lies to tell at school." The mechanical voice attempted to respond, but Margaret continued over it, her frustration boiling over into accusation. Your son claims you're some kind of important architect, but his clothing and supplies suggest otherwise. These stories about special buses and building cities are getting completely out of hand. She paused only briefly as the artificial-sounding voice tried to interject, then continued her devastating critique. Stop filling his head with grandiose fantasies, Mr. Williams. He needs to learn about real life, not impossible dreams. Either come in for a real conversation or stop the elaborate storytelling. I don't have time for games. Margaret hung up, feeling righteously vindicated. She had finally confronted what she saw as irresponsible parenting, disguised as imagination. That afternoon, she reported the conversation to Principal Hayes as a difficult parent contact, confident she had protected Ethan from further embarrassment. Meanwhile, Marcus Williams sat in stunned silence, struggling to comprehend the teacher's accusations and cruelty. How could he explain to his 8-year-old son that his teacher had called his father a liar? Monday morning brought Ethan's return to school, but the bright-eyed boy who had once bubbled with enthusiasm about his father's work seemed diminished. Margaret watched him take his seat quietly, no longer eager to share during morning circle time. When she announced their weekly community helpers discussion, Ethan kept his eyes fixed on his desk. "Who wants to tell us about their family's work this week?" Margaret asked, expecting the usual flood of raised hands. Ethan's hand remained folded in his lap. When Margaret gently encouraged him to participate, he simply shook his head and whispered, "I don't want to talk about it anymore." During creative writing time, the change became even more apparent. Ethan, who had previously written detailed stories about building projects and helping families, produced a single paragraph about a boy whose daddy can't talk to mean people because they don't listen. The story's melancholy tone struck Margaret as oddly mature for an 8-year-old. Margaret felt a surge of vindication. Her intervention had clearly worked. Ethan was finally facing reality instead of living in fantasies. She convinced herself that this withdrawal was a necessary step toward honest self-expression. Tuesday brought unexpected resistance from Sarah Chen, the young teacher who had befriended Ethan during reading enrichment. Sarah approached Margaret during lunch with obvious concern. "I'm worried about Ethan," Sarah said, settling into the chair across from Margaret's desk. "He's completely stopped participating in our discussions about careers and community helpers. Yesterday, when we talked about how families contribute to society, he wouldn't even make eye contact." Margaret defended her intervention with practiced authority. "Sometimes children need reality checks. Sarah, Ethan was developing an unhealthy relationship with fantasy. Better he learns the truth now than face embarrassment later." Sarah's young face showed clear disagreement. "But what if he was telling the truth? What if his father really is doing important work? The boy's stories were so detailed, so consistent. Wouldn't it be devastating if we dismissed something real?" "In 28 years of teaching," Margaret replied firmly, "I've learned to distinguish between children's hopes and actual reality. Trust me on this one." But Sarah's questions planted tiny seeds of doubt that Margaret worked hard to ignore. Wednesday afternoon brought a different kind of evidence as parents gathered for pickup. The whispers had intensified, but now they carried a sharper edge of judgment directed not just at the Williams family, but at Margaret's handling of the situation. "I heard Mrs. Johnson confronted that man about lying to his son," murmured Patricia Wells, mother of a 4th grader. "About time someone stood up to these families who think they can make up stories." But James Miller, the custodian, offered a different perspective as he collected trash from the pickup area. "That driver who comes for the Williams boy," he told Margaret. "I've been watching him for weeks. Never honks, never shows impatience. Even when the kid's running late, just sits there reading thick books about architecture and city planning. Seems patient, respectful. Not the kind of behavior you'd expect from someone living a lie." Margaret felt her first real flicker of uncertainty, but pushed it aside. Patient behavior didn't prove anything about truthfulness. Thursday brought Sarah Chen's discovery. Unable to ignore her growing concerns, the young teacher had spent her evening researching Marcus Williams online. What she found made her stomach drop. The Memphis City Planning website featured a prominent bio of Marcus Williams, award-winning architect specializing in accessible community development. His current project, the new Riverside community, was described as a revolutionary approach to affordable housing that would serve as a model for cities nationwide. The website included detailed information about specialized transportation for stakeholder visits, specifically mentioning accommodations for school-age children of workers and residents. Every single detail Ethan had proudly shared with his class was not only true, but actually understated the scope of his father's accomplishments. Sarah spent Thursday evening debating whether to immediately confront Margaret with this information. She understood the delicate politics of challenging a veteran teacher's judgment, but the magnitude of the mistake felt too important to ignore. Friday morning brought the local newspaper's featured article on urban development, with a large photograph of Marcus Williams signing documents at a groundbreaking ceremony. The caption clearly identified him as a deaf architect whose innovative approach to inclusive design had attracted national attention. The article described the new Riverside development in glowing terms, highlighting its potential to transform how cities approach affordable housing. The article included specific details about the project's transportation accommodations, designed to ensure that all community members, regardless of physical abilities, could participate in the planning process. The special bus Ethan had mentioned was actually a prototype for citywide accessible transit. Sarah could no longer remain silent. She brought the newspaper to Margaret during lunch, her hands trembling slightly as she placed it on the desk. "Margaret, I think we need to talk about Ethan Williams." Margaret read the article with growing horror, her professional confidence cracking as she recognized detail after detail from Ethan's supposedly fictional stories. But even confronted with documentary evidence, her pride fought against admitting such a fundamental error in judgment. "Anyone can be in a newspaper photo," she said weakly. "This could be a completely different Marcus Williams." But doubt had taken root and was growing rapidly. Margaret spent her weekend consumed by research. Diving deeper into Marcus Williams's actual career, she found architectural awards, community development honors, testimonials from dozens of families whose lives had been transformed by his inclusive housing projects. Photo after photo showed the same quiet man she had glimpsed in the van, surrounded by grateful residents and fellow professionals. The weight of her mistake pressed down like a physical burden. She had not simply doubted a child's story, she had attacked a grieving widower's character and damaged his son's trust in the fairness of adult authority. Meanwhile, Ethan's deterioration continued throughout the week. He stopped participating in class discussions entirely, sat alone during lunch, and drew pictures of empty houses instead of the bustling communities he had once depicted with such joy. When other children asked about his father's work, he simply said, "He helps people, but nobody believes it." His academic work, previously exemplary, became perfunctory and brief. Writing assignments that had once filled entire pages with enthusiastic detail now consisted of single paragraphs that met minimum requirements and nothing more. The change was so dramatic that other teachers began to notice. "What happened to that bright little Williams boy?" asked Tom Harrison during a staff meeting. "He used to be one of our most engaged students." Marcus, meanwhile, struggled with his own agonizing decisions. His son's obvious distress weighed heavily on him, compounded by the humiliation of being called a liar by someone in a position of authority over Ethan. He reduced his worksite visits to accommodate regular school pickup times, hoping that more conventional scheduling might ease the situation. But colleagues noticed his distraction during important project meetings. The man who had built his career on clear communication and collaborative problem-solving seemed withdrawn and uncertain. He wrote multiple draft letters to the school principal, explaining the situation and requesting resolution. But each attempt felt inadequate to address the complexity of what had occurred. How could he explain that a teacher's prejudice had not only wounded him personally, but had taught his son to doubt the value of truth itself? As the week ended, the school community found itself inadvertently divided. Some parents supported Margaret's tough love approach, believing teachers needed to check unrealistic stories. Others grew increasingly uncomfortable with what seemed like targeted skepticism toward a family that was simply different. The controversy had begun to affect the entire educational environment, creating an atmosphere where students wondered whether their own family stories would be believed or dismissed. The damage was spreading far beyond one classroom. threatening the trust that made effective teaching possible. Margaret faced the weekend knowing that Monday would bring impossible choices: admit to a devastating professional error or continue defending a position that evidence increasingly proved wrong. Margaret Johnson arrived at Riverside Elementary at 6:30 Monday morning, hoping the early hour would spare her from colleagues' questioning glances. The weight of her weekend research pressed heavily on her conscience as she approached the main entrance, keys jangling in her trembling hands. A figure on the bench outside the school caught her attention, a man in simple work clothes, quietly reading what appeared to be a thick architectural manual. Margaret assumed he was waiting for a custodial interview or maintenance appointment, arriving early as many job applicants did, feeling obligated to be helpful. Margaret approached him. "Excuse me, I'm sorry, but the school doesn't open until 7. If you're here for an appointment, the main office won't be available for another half hour." The man looked up and smiled warmly, offering a small wave. When he opened his mouth to respond, only soft, indistinct vocal sounds emerged. Margaret watched with growing confusion as he gestured expressively, clearly trying to communicate something important. Reaching into a leather portfolio beside him, the man pulled out a small notebook and wrote quickly, then turned it toward Margaret. The carefully formed letters made her stomach plummet. "Are you Mrs. Johnson?" Margaret's professional composure cracked as the horrible realization dawned. This quiet, patient man reading architectural texts at dawn was not a job applicant. Her voice came out as a whisper. Are you Mr. Williams?" The man nodded gently and wrote another line. "I'm Marcus Williams, Ethan's father." He reached into his portfolio again, producing a driver's license and several business cards that confirmed his identity beyond any doubt. Margaret felt the world tilt as Marcus continued writing with swift, practiced movements. "I've been wanting to meet you. I came early hoping we could talk before Ethan arrives. Mr. Williams, I had no idea." Margaret stammered, but Marcus held up a gentle hand, requesting patience. He pulled out a thick folder and began laying its contents on the bench between them: project blueprints, newspaper clippings, professional awards, and photographs. Every single item validated the stories Ethan had proudly shared with his class. Detailed architectural plans for the new Riverside community showed exactly the kind of comprehensive neighborhood design the boy had described. Awards for innovative, accessible housing bore Marcus's name and photograph. Newspaper articles praised his revolutionary approach to inclusive urban development. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she recognized detail after detail from Ethan's supposedly fictional narratives. The special bus was indeed special, a prototype for citywide accessible transportation. The whole new city was a 200-unit affordable housing development with community centers and accessible playgrounds. Marcus wrote steadily, his expression patient but serious. "Ethan asked me last week why his teacher called me a liar." Margaret's breath caught as she read the devastating words. "He wanted to know if he should stop talking about my work because people don't believe him." The next line hit her like a physical blow. "He asked if being deaf makes me less of a father." Margaret's face crumpled as the full magnitude of her assumptions became clear. She had not simply doubted a child's stories, she had taught him to question his own worth and his father's dignity. Marcus continued writing with quiet determination. "I told him some people need time to understand differences. But Mrs. Johnson, understanding and cruelty are not the same thing." He spread the blueprints wider, pointing to specific features with professional pride. 200 affordable housing units, each designed with accessibility considerations. A community center with state-of-the-art communication technology. Playgrounds that accommodated children with various physical abilities. Transportation systems that ensured no resident would be isolated due to mobility challenges. "This is what my son sees when he talks about building cities," Marcus wrote. "Hope for families who need safe, affordable homes." Margaret watched his pen move across the paper with increasing anguish. "My wife died 2 years ago. Ethan is everything to me." The words blurred through her tears. "She always said I was lucky I can't hear cruel words, but I can see kind hearts. Ethan doesn't have that protection. He hears everything. The devastating truth settled over Margaret like a suffocating weight. Her voice, which she had used to wound this family, represented everything Marcus's son had learned to fear about adult authority. Marcus wrote one final, crucial message. I'm not angry at you, Mrs. Johnson, but I need to know if my son will be safe here. Can you help him trust again, or should I find somewhere else? The question hung in the morning air like a judgment. Marcus set down his pen and looked at Margaret with patient expectation, allowing her the space to respond to the most important test of her career. Margaret struggled to find words adequate for the magnitude of her mistake. She who had prided herself on clear communication sat speechless, realizing that her voice, which had caused such damage, must now somehow find a way to heal. In the distance, school bus engines began their morning rumble, signaling that the school day would soon begin. Students would arrive expecting safety, fairness, and adults who listened before judging. Marcus began quietly gathering his materials, and Margaret realized with panic that he was preparing to leave, possibly forever. The man had given her irrefutable evidence of his integrity, and a clear choice: prove herself worthy of his son's trust, or watch them walk away from a school that had failed them both. The morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the schoolyard where Margaret Johnson faced the most crucial decision of her teaching career. Margaret attempted to speak, but her words felt hollow and inadequate against the weight of Marcus's quiet dignity. I'm so sorry, Mr. Williams. I had no idea. I should have listened. I should have. The apologies tumbled out in broken fragments, each one sounding more pathetic than the last. Marcus wrote with deliberate precision. Ideas aren't the problem, Mrs. Johnson. Assumptions are. He touched his throat, then his ear, then wrote, I can't speak, but I always listen. The devastating parallel struck Margaret like a physical blow. She, who possessed the gift of speech, had chosen not to hear. He, who couldn't vocalize, had spent his life perfecting the art of understanding. The rumble of arriving school buses shattered the morning stillness. Margaret watched with growing dread as students began pouring from the vehicles, their cheerful voices carrying across the schoolyard. Among them, she spotted Ethan's familiar figure stepping carefully down the bus steps. The boy's face lit up momentarily when he saw his father and teacher together, hope flickering in his eyes. But as he approached, that hope faded into the guarded expression Margaret had grown to recognize, the look of a child who had learned that adult conversations often brought pain. Hi, Daddy. Hi, Mrs. Johnson, Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying none of its former enthusiasm. The tension was palpable as the child stood between the two adults, waiting to discover whether this meeting would bring more hurt. Marcus reached out and gently squeezed his son's shoulder, while Margaret struggled with the knowledge that her next words might determine this family's entire future. Ethan looked up at his father with heartbreaking directness. Are you here to take me to a different school? Marcus hesitated, his eyes moving from his son to Margaret, then back. He wrote slowly, Do you want to stay here, son? Ethan's response shattered what remained of Margaret's composure. I like learning, but I don't like when people don't believe me. He paused, then added with devastating honesty, Sarah says my stories are interesting, but most people think I make things up. Maybe it's easier if I just stop talking about our family. Margaret saw clearly for the first time how her disbelief had affected not just Ethan, but his relationship with truth itself. This articulate, bright child was learning to censor himself, to doubt the validity of his own experiences. She had trained him to see his family's accomplishments as embarrassing secrets rather than sources of pride. Other students began gathering nearby, sensing the unusual drama of an early morning parent conference. Some approached to greet Ethan, while others held back, uncertain about the evident tension. Margaret noticed their whispered conversations and worried glances. Sarah Chen arrived for her early morning duties and immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. Her eyes moved from Margaret's tear-stained face to Marcus's calm but serious expression. and she understood that the confrontation she had feared was finally happening. The growing commotion attracted Principal Dorothy Hayes, who arrived with her usual brisk efficiency but stopped short when she saw the assembled group. Dorothy quickly assessed the situation and made a swift decision. "Let's continue this conversation in my office, shall we?" As they moved toward the building, Margaret became acutely aware of the whispers following them. Word would spread quickly through the close-knit school community, and she knew her professional reputation hung in the balance. In the principal's office, Marcus methodically displayed his credentials and project materials for Dorothy's review. Margaret watched her longtime colleague's expression change from polite attention to genuine shock as the evidence mounted. Dorothy's eyes widened as she recognized the scope and importance of Marcus's work. "Mr. Williams," Dorothy said, her voice carefully professional, "I had no idea about the extent of your community involvement. Your project sounds remarkable." Marcus wrote, "The remarkable thing is having a son proud enough to share our work with his classmates. Or rather, who used to be proud." The professional implications began dawning on Dorothy. A discrimination complaint against the school could be devastating, particularly given Marcus's high profile in the Memphis development community. But beyond administrative concerns, she could see the personal devastation in both Margaret's and Ethan's faces. Margaret's composure finally shattered completely. Through her tears, she admitted to Dorothy and Marcus the full extent of her prejudiced assumptions. "I thought I was protecting him from disappointment," she sobbed. "I've seen so many children coached to tell impressive lies about their families, and I thought... Marcus wrote with steady compassion, "You thought being different meant being dishonest." Dorothy quietly revealed information that made Margaret's shame even deeper. "Mr. Williams, I should mention that we've received several anonymous donations this year: new playground equipment, hearing assistance devices for our classrooms, library books about diverse families. The paperwork shows they came from the Williams Foundation." Margaret stared in horror. While she had been questioning this family's integrity, Marcus had been quietly supporting the very school that was failing his son. Ethan, who had been listening to the adult conversation with growing confusion, finally found his voice. "Why did Mrs. Johnson call my daddy a liar?" The innocent question hung in the air like an accusation. The room fell silent as the adult struggled to explain adult prejudice to a child who had done nothing wrong. Margaret watched Ethan's face and saw her own reflection in his eyes, the face of someone who had failed him completely. "Did I say something wrong about Daddy's work?" Ethan continued, his voice growing smaller. "Should I not have talked about the houses and the special bus?" Marcus immediately wrote a note and showed it to his son. "You did nothing wrong. Ever. Your stories are true and important." He pulled Ethan into a protective embrace while maintaining direct eye contact with Margaret. Dorothy found herself managing a crisis that extended far beyond a single classroom. Word of the confrontation was already spreading through the school community, with parents taking sides and questioning the school's handling of family communications. Local media attention became a real possibility given Marcus's prominence in Memphis urban development. The story of a deaf architect facing discrimination at his son's school could attract unwanted publicity for Riverside Elementary. Margaret faced the horrifying reality that her single phone call might not only end her career, but damage the school's reputation permanently. More importantly, she had traumatized a grieving family who had entrusted their most precious possession to her care. Marcus held the power to file a formal discrimination complaint that could destroy Margaret's career and seriously damage the school. His documented attempts to communicate appropriately, combined with Margaret's recorded hostility, created an indefensible case. But as Margaret watched him comfort his son, she realized that Marcus faced his own impossible choice: pursue justice through official channels, or focus on healing his child's wounded spirit. The morning sun streamed through Dorothy's office windows as Marcus stood to leave. Having gathered enough evidence of an unwelcoming environment, Ethan asked the question that broke everyone's heart. "Are we moving again, Daddy?" Margaret realized that her actions threatened to force another traumatic upheaval on a child who had already lost his mother and been uprooted multiple times. As Marcus packed his materials, Margaret understood that this moment would define her legacy as an educator, not the 28 years of service, but this single catastrophic failure of judgment and compassion. Instead of storming out in righteous anger, Marcus Williams made a decision that surprised everyone in the room. He requested a private moment with Margaret, asking Dorothy and Ethan to wait outside while he and the teacher had what he wrote would be a crucial conversation. Dorothy hesitated, concerned about leaving Margaret alone with a parent who had legitimate grounds for complaint. But Marcus's calm demeanor suggested he sought resolution rather than confrontation. 5 minutes, she agreed, leading a confused Ethan to the outer office, alone with Margaret. Marcus pulled out several sheets of paper covered in his careful handwriting. "I wrote this letter last week but didn't send it," he wrote on a fresh page. "Maybe it's time you heard what I couldn't say on the phone." Margaret's hands trembled as she began reading Marcus's prepared words. "Mrs. Johnson, I lost my hearing at birth, but I gained something many people never find the ability to truly observe. I watch faces, body language, the spaces between words where truth lives. When Ethan talks about my work, his eyes shine because he's proud of helping people. When he mentions the special bus, he's thinking about Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly woman who can't climb regular bus steps but comes to our community meetings because we provide accessible transport. You heard special bus and thought fantasy. He was describing dignity. You heard building a whole city and thought impossible. He was describing hope, his hope that families like the Chens, who lost their home in last year's flood, will have a safe place to live. I don't blame you for not believing him initially. I blame you for not checking before condemning." Margaret continued reading, each word cutting deeper into her conscience. "Every week, Ethan comes home with stories about his classmates' parents. He knows Sarah's mom is a nurse because she talks about helping sick people. He knows Jake's dad is a firefighter because Jake shares rescue stories. He assumed his father's work was equally worth sharing. After your phone call, he asked me if being different makes our family less important. I told him no, but children believe their teachers more than their parents." The letter continued with devastating clarity. "The development we're building isn't just housing, it's proof that different doesn't mean less. Deaf architects design better spaces because we understand navigation differently. Single fathers raise children who value communication because we've learned to say more with less. Ethan didn't need you to believe his stories. He needed you to believe in him. Now I need to know, can you help him trust again? Or should I find teachers who see potential instead of problems?" As Margaret finished reading, she looked up to find Marcus watching her with patient expectation. The weight of his words and her failure pressed down like a physical burden. She realized she had dismissed Marcus not just as a liar, but as less credible because he was different, because he communicated differently, because he challenged her assumptions about what successful families looked like. "Mr. Williams," she whispered, "I need to understand what I did wrong, all of it." Marcus wrote quickly, "Are you prepared to hear the truth, even if it's uncomfortable?" Margaret nodded, and Marcus began revealing the full scope of her mistakes. He explained that the text-only communication preference wasn't evasiveness, it was an accommodation for his hearing loss. The relay service she had encountered wasn't a deception, but assistive technology that she had refused to understand. Margaret's face paled as Marcus detailed his attempts to communicate professionally with the school, every barrier he had encountered, every assumption made about his capabilities, every instance where his accommodations had been interpreted as problems rather than solutions. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed Margaret the text-to-speech app he had been using during her devastating phone call. "When you heard this," he wrote, demonstrating the mechanical voice, "you assumed it was fake. It was my voice, Mrs. Johnson, the only voice I have." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had interpreted assistive technology as deception, had refused to recognize that Marcus was trying to communicate on her terms while she dismissed his efforts as games. Marcus continued writing, "When you said I was filling Ethan's head with fantasies, you were telling a deaf man that his communication wasn't real, his work wasn't valid, his love for his son wasn't enough." Margaret's understanding of her prejudice deepened as Marcus revealed more painful truths. He showed her photographs from his wife's funeral, explaining how Ethan had already lost one parent and feared losing connection to the other. "After your call, he asked if you were right if deaf people can't be good fathers." The personal cost of her assumptions became clear as Marcus described Ethan's deteriorating confidence. The boy had stopped signing at home, ashamed of his family's different communication style. He had asked his father to stop picking him up in the accessibility van, embarrassed by their family's visibility. Marcus then revealed the community impact of his work. He showed Margaret testimonials from new Riverside community residents, elderly people who could age in place thanks to accessible design, families escaping homelessness through affordable housing, children thriving in inclusive playgrounds that accommodated every ability. This is what Ethan sees when he talks about building cities. Marcus wrote, hope, community, families helped. Margaret spent the next hour learning about Marcus's actual career trajectory, his architectural awards, his innovative approaches to universal design, his quiet leadership in Memphis's urban renewal. Every assumption she had made about his capabilities, his character, his worthiness as a parent had been not just wrong, but the opposite of truth. The conversation revealed the broader implications of her prejudice. Marcus explained how discrimination against deaf parents was common, how their children often faced skepticism about their family stories, how bias masqueraded as protection. Ethan has heard these doubts before, Marcus wrote, in restaurants, at stores, from adults who assume deaf parents can't properly raise hearing children. You were supposed to be different. You were supposed to be safe. Margaret realized she had become part of a pattern of discrimination that Marcus and Ethan faced regularly. Her classroom, which should have been a refuge from bias, had become another place where difference was viewed with suspicion. Marcus then revealed his own painful decision process. Multiple drafts of letters to the principal, consultations with disability advocates, consideration of legal action. I could destroy your career, he wrote bluntly. I have documentation of everything. But instead of threats, Marcus wrote about choices. I can seek justice, or I can seek healing. I can fight this school, or I can help it change. What I cannot do is watch my son learn to hide his family. Margaret understood the profound generosity Marcus was offering, the chance to learn from her mistake rather than simply suffer consequences. Why, she asked, why give me this opportunity? Marcus wrote his response carefully, because Ethan needs to see that adults can change. He needs to know that mistakes don't have to become permanent harm. The reversal was complete. Margaret, who had entered this conversation as Ethan's protector, now understood that Marcus was protecting her, offering growth where he could demand punishment, extending grace where he had every right to seek justice. Marcus stood and gathered his materials, but this time not in anger. I'm not leaving, Mrs. Johnson, but I am choosing. I'm choosing to believe you can become the teacher my son needs. He wrote one final note. The question isn't whether you made a mistake. The question is what you'll do now that you know the truth. As Marcus prepared to collect Ethan from the outer office, Margaret realized she stood at a crossroads that would define not just her career, but her character. The truth had been revealed, the reversal complete. Now came the hardest part, proving worthy of the second chance she didn't deserve but desperately needed. The morning sun streamed through the office windows as Margaret faced the most important test of her life, not of her teaching skills, but of her capacity for growth, humility, and genuine change. Margaret Johnson stood before Marcus and Ethan Williams the following Tuesday afternoon, her hands clasped tightly to stop their trembling. Principal Dorothy Hayes and Sarah Chen flanked her as witnesses to what she knew would be the most important words of her teaching career. Mr. Williams, Ethan, Margaret began, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. I owe you both a formal apology. I made terrible assumptions about your family based on my own prejudices. I failed to listen, failed to investigate, and caused harm to a child who trusted me with his truth. Ethan's eyes widened as he watched an adult take full responsibility without making excuses. Marcus wrote quickly, Thank you for your honesty, Margaret continued, addressing Ethan directly. Your stories about your father's work were absolutely true, and I should have celebrated your pride in his accomplishments instead of doubting them. Your father is building something wonderful for our community, and you have every right to be proud. That afternoon, Margaret enrolled in disability awareness training through the Memphis Education Department. She requested that Marcus serve as a consultant for developing new school communication policies that would accommodate families with diverse needs. The woman who had refused to understand different communication styles now committed herself to learning sign language. Within a week, Margaret invited Marcus to present to Ethan's class about his architectural work. The presentation transformed the classroom dynamic completely. Students gathered eagerly around Marcus's architectural models, fascinated by building blueprints and accessibility demonstrations. They peppered him with questions about sign language, assistive technology, and inclusive design principles. Ethan's face glowed with restored pride as his classmates expressed genuine enthusiasm about his father's work. "Your dad is so cool!" exclaimed Jake Miller. "Can he teach us more sign language?" The class embraced the new Riverside community as their year-long civics project. Students interviewed future residents, documented construction progress, and learned about urban planning principles. Ethan became the natural bridge between school and construction site, his earlier shame replaced by confident expertise. Margaret's understanding of the transportation issue deepened when Marcus explained the pickup coordination. The accessibility van served multiple community members, requiring careful scheduling around medical appointments and community meetings. Ethan's later pickup times weren't inconvenience, but inclusion, ensuring elderly residents could attend planning sessions that shaped their future homes. The story of Margaret's transformation spread through Memphis's educational community. Other schools invited Marcus to present on accessibility and inclusion, while Margaret became an advocate for communication training among veteran teachers. Her willingness to confront her own biases inspired colleagues to examine their assumptions about families who seemed different. Ethan's healing progressed gradually, but steadily. His enthusiastic storytelling returned as classmates consistently responded with interest rather than skepticism. Trust rebuilt through Margaret's consistent encouragement and Marcus's patient involvement in school activities. The father-son relationship strengthened through working together to create positive change from painful experience. Riverside Elementary implemented new protocols for parent communication accommodation, ensuring that staff understood assistive technology and disability etiquette. Emergency contact procedures were updated to respect diverse communication needs, while bias recognition became part of mandatory professional development. Local media featured the school community partnership around New Riverside as a model for educational engagement with urban development. Margaret's growth journey inspired other educators to seek bias training, while Marcus's work gained additional recognition for its innovative approach to inclusive design. Margaret's teaching philosophy underwent fundamental transformation. She began approaching student stories with curiosity rather than skepticism, investigating claims rather than dismissing them. Her relationships with families from diverse backgrounds deepened as she learned to listen more carefully and judge less quickly. 6 months later, New Riverside Community celebrated its grand opening with Riverside Elementary students as honored guests. Ethan stood beside his father at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, surrounded by supportive classmates and teachers who now understood the magnitude of Marcus's achievement. At the ceremony, Marcus presented a substantial donation check to Riverside Elementary for accessibility improvements. The funds would purchase new playground equipment designed for children with various abilities, hearing assistance technology for classrooms, and inclusive learning materials. The check bore a dedication for a school learning to listen. Margaret received the check with tears in her eyes, understanding it represented forgiveness and faith in her capacity for continued growth. The woman who had once dismissed this family's truth now held tangible proof of their generosity and grace. Correspondence between Margaret and Marcus continued throughout the school year as their professional relationship evolved from crisis to collaboration. Margaret visited the completed community development, witnessing firsthand how Marcus's vision had transformed vacant lots into thriving neighborhoods where families of all backgrounds and abilities could flourish. Ethan's confidence soared as he became a peer advocate for including diverse voices in classroom discussions. His presentation skills developed through sharing his father's ongoing projects with other classes, while his academic performance reflected his renewed sense of belonging in the school environment. 9 months after that devastating phone call, Margaret received nomination for a district award recognizing professional development and community engagement. Marcus had become a regular school volunteer, bringing accessibility perspectives to facility planning and curriculum development. The final image that would stay with Margaret forever came during spring graduation ceremonies. She watched Ethan confidently present his father's latest project to an audience of families and community leaders, his voice strong and proud as he described plans for Memphis's next inclusive housing development. Margaret reflected on the lesson that had transformed her teaching. Listening required more than hearing words. It demanded setting aside assumptions, investigating before judging, and recognizing that children's stories often contain truths adults weren't ready to understand. The silence she had once interpreted as evasion had taught her that communication takes many forms, that accommodation isn't special treatment but equal access, and that families who seem different often have the most important stories to share. Riverside Elementary had become a place where every voice mattered, where difference was celebrated rather than suspected, and where one teacher's willingness to grow had created ripples of positive change that would benefit students for years to come. Margaret's journey from prejudice to understanding revealed profound truths about family, gratitude, and the courage to change. The Williams family taught an entire school community that differences in communication don't diminish love, that accommodations aren't favors but basic dignity, and that children's pride in their families should be protected and celebrated. Marcus's extraordinary grace in offering forgiveness instead of demanding justice demonstrated the transformative power of choosing healing over punishment. His quiet strength showed that true leadership comes not from demanding recognition, but from building bridges even when others have burned them down. Ethan's resilience reminded everyone that children possess wisdom adults often overlook. His unwavering love for his father, despite facing disbelief and ridicule, exemplified the pure loyalty that defines family bonds. The boy's capacity to trust again after being wounded showed that healing is possible when adults prove worthy of second chances. Margaret's transformation proved that it's never too late to confront our biases, admit our mistakes, and commit to genuine change. Her willingness to learn sign language, advocate for inclusive policies, and publicly acknowledge her errors turned personal failure into community growth. The story's ultimate lesson resonates clearly. Before we judge what we don't understand, we must first choose to listen. Have you ever been wrongly accused or misunderstood like Marcus Williams, where your truth was dismissed because you were different?